The gunfire hadn't started yet, but the air in Belhaven General's emergency room already tasted like copper and fear, and the only person who seemed to notice was the nurse nobody bothered to learn the name of. They called her the new girl, the transfer, the quiet one who took the shifts everyone else refused. They thought she was just a nurse. They were dead wrong. 6 weeks earlier, Elena Cross had walked through the sliding glass doors of Belhaven General with a single duffel bag and a transfer letter that raised more questions than it answered. Her personnel file listed 11 years of nursing experience, 3 of them redacted with thick black bars that no administrator had bothered to question. She moved through the intake process the way she moved through everything, with an economy of motion that made her seem almost invisible. Her voice low, her eyes steady, her sleeves always rolled down past her wrists, even in the suffocating heat of a July heat wave. Nobody asked why. In a hospital this size, nobody had the time. The charge nurse assigned her the graveyard rotation without so much as a glance up from her clipboard, the kind of shift that chewed through staff and spit them out within a year, 3 in the morning until 11. The hours when the emergency room filled with the wreckage of the city's worst decisions. Elena accepted the assignment without complaint. She had learned long ago that complaint was a currency she no longer spent. She was competent in a way that unsettled people who valued noise over precision. She started intravenous lines on the first attempt every single time, even on patients whose veins had collapsed from years of substance abuse. She read a crashing patient's vitals before the monitors finished processing the data, some instinct in her faster than the machines. The other nurses noticed, but noticing wasn't the same as respecting, and in the hierarchy of Belhaven's emergency department, Elena Cross ranked somewhere below the vending machine. There was a scar that ran from her left collarbone down across her shoulder blade, pale and rope-like beneath her scrub top, and when a curious resident once asked about it during a slow Tuesday shift, Elena answered without looking up from her charting. "A car accident," she said. "Long time ago." The resident believed her because there was no reason not to, and the lie slid so easily off her tongue that it barely registered as one anymore. It was a cover story worn smooth from years of use, the kind of lie that had saved more lives than it had ever damaged. The first hint came on a Thursday night in her 3rd week, when a delivery truck jackknifed on the interstate and sent 7 vehicles into a screaming, metal-shredding pile-up that flooded the emergency room with more trauma than the department had bandwidth to handle. Doctors shouted over one another. A resident froze at the sight of an open femoral fracture, the white of bone visible through torn denim. Chaos took the room the way floodwater takes a basement, fast and complete, and in the middle of it, Elena Cross moved like the eye of the storm. She triaged 4 patients in under 2 minutes, her hands never trembling, her voice never rising above a calm, clipped register that cut through the noise better than any shout could have. She packed a chest wound with a technique the attending physician had never seen outside a military field manual, applying a tourniquet with a snap and a twist that stopped arterial bleeding in seconds rather than the usual frantic minute. When a nurse froze holding a needle over a patient's chest, unsure whether the trapped air behind the ribs warranted immediate decompression, Elena took the needle from her hand without a word and did it herself, and the patient's collapsed lung re-inflated with a hiss that sounded almost like relief. Nobody thanked her. Nobody asked where she'd learned to work like that. The attending simply muttered something about lucky guesses and moved on to the next crisis, and Elena wiped her hands on a fresh pair of gloves and returned to her rounds as though nothing extraordinary had happened at all, because to her, nothing had. She had done far worse things, in far worse places, with far less light to work by. The department's chief of emergency medicine, Dr. Gerald Kane, ran Belhaven's ER the way a small tyrant runs a border town, with equal parts insecurity and unearned authority. He was a man who had built his entire identity around the letters after his name and the corner office that came with them, and he despised anything he could not immediately categorize and control. Elena Cross, with her sealed file and her unreadable calm, was precisely that kind of anomaly, and Kane decided within their first meeting that he did not like her. He made that dislike into policy. She was scheduled for every holiday, every double shift, every rotation nobody else wanted, while junior nurses half her experience received the assignments she should have earned by seniority alone. In staff meetings, Kane spoke over her when she offered input, cutting her sentences off mid-thought with a dismissive wave, and once, in front of the entire morning briefing, he held up her file and asked the room at large whether anyone could explain why administration had saddled his department with, in his words, a paper pusher who apparently couldn't cut it anywhere real. Elena said nothing. She sat in the back row with her hands folded and let the laughter ripple past her like wind past a mountain, because she understood something none of them did. Somewhere in a locked drawer inside the director's office sat a file that outranked every decision Gerald Kane had ever made in his entire career, and one day, whether he wanted it to or not, that file was going to open. That day arrived on a grey Tuesday morning, 3 weeks into her humiliation, when a uniformed officer walked into the administrative wing of Belhaven General, without an appointment and without a smile. He was broad-shouldered, close-cropped, and carried himself with the rigid economy of someone who had spent decades taking orders and giving them in equal measure. He asked for Director Alan Whitfield by name, and when Whitfield's assistant hesitated, the officer simply repeated the name once more, slower until she buzzed him through. He placed a sealed manila envelope on Whitfield's desk, stamped in red block letters that read, "Eyes only, Director Soul. Access, do not distribute." He offered no explanation. When Whitfield asked what it concerned, the officer only said that the sender trusted the director to read it before making any further personnel decisions, and that someone would be in contact soon regarding a patient transfer. Then he left the way he had come, without another word, his boots striking the polished floor in a rhythm that sounded, to Whitfield's unsettled ear, almost like a countdown. Whitfield stared at the envelope for a long moment before sliding it into his desk drawer, unopened. He had a budget meeting in 11 minutes and a hospital board breathing down his neck about quarterly numbers, and whatever mystery sat inside that envelope would have to wait its turn behind the 1,000 other fires a hospital director spent his days extinguishing. It was, he would later admit to himself in the quiet hours after everything came apart, the single worst decision of his professional life. The file had one rule: only the director could open it. He wished he had sooner. 2 days later, an unmarked black sedan rolled into Belhaven's ambulance bay ahead of the scheduled transport schedule, disgorging a gurney flanked by 2 men in plain clothes, who moved with a precision that had nothing civilian about it. On the gurney lay a man in his early 30s, dog tags absent, but a tattoo of crossed rifles visible on his forearm beneath the bandaging, his vitals unstable from a gunshot wound to the abdomen that the transferring paperwork blandly described as an industrial accident. His name, according to the intake sheet, was Cole Bennett. Dr. Kane took one look at the incomplete paperwork, decided the case was more trouble than it was worth, and assigned it to the graveyard shift without a second thought, which meant it landed, as most unwanted things did, on Elena Cross's roster. She read the chart in under 10 seconds and felt something cold settle behind her ribs, a recognition that had nothing to do with medicine and everything to do with the tattoo, the entry wound angle, and the particular caliber of round the trauma surgeon had extracted from muscle an hour earlier. She had seen that exact combination before, in a different country, under a different sky, surrounded by people who no longer existed. She said nothing to Kane. She said nothing to anyone. She simply moved Cole Bennett's bed closer to the nurse's station, checked the hallway sightlines twice, and began monitoring his vitals with an intensity that no one on staff would have recognized as anything other than diligence, when in truth it was something closer to a soldier standing watch. Bennett drifted in and out of consciousness through the evening, fever climbing, blood pressure a fragile thread. Around midnight his eyes opened fully for the first time, unfocused, then sharpening as they landed on Elena's face, and something in his expression cracked open with a recognition that startled her more than she let show. "Widow," he whispered, using a name she had buried under 6 years of silence. "Is that really you?" She leaned close, her voice a blade wrapped in velvet, low enough that the words never traveled past the curtain. "Not anymore," she told him. "Not here. Rest, soldier. Whatever brought you to my door, I promise you it won't finish the job." He tried to laugh, and the laugh turned into a cough that brought a fleck of blood to his lips, and the machine beside him screamed a warning that pulled 2 other nurses running. Elena stabilized him with the calm brutality of someone who had done it 100 times in far worse conditions, adjusting his fluids, correcting his airway, buying him another hour of borrowed time, and when the crisis passed, she stood at the foot of his bed and allowed herself exactly 4 seconds of stillness before she went back to being nobody again. But something had shifted in her. A switch flipped somewhere deep beneath the practiced calm, because Cole Bennett did not simply wander into gunfire by accident, and men who survived what he had survived did not get transferred to civilian hospitals without someone somewhere already hunting them. That someone arrived at 2 in the morning, dressed in a maintenance uniform stolen from a supply closet 3 floors down, carrying a suppressed pistol tucked against his thigh, and a face that had been trained never to show fear or mercy in equal measure. His name, though no one in that hallway would ever learn it, was Victor Dresden, a contractor who had built a profitable career finishing jobs that governments preferred to pretend never existed, and he had exactly 1 task written on the ledger of that night. Cole Bennett was a loose thread from an operation that had gone catastrophically wrong 2 years earlier, and loose threads in Dresden's line of work did not get to heal. He walked past the security desk with a badge that would not have survived a second glance from anyone actually paying attention, and Belhaven General, like most hospitals built on the assumption that violence stayed in the streets outside, was not built for anyone paying attention. He reached the trauma ward corridor at 2:11 in the morning, exactly 4 doors down from where Elena Cross sat, charting beside a sleeping patient, and he had already drawn the pistol from his waistband when the first scream sounded from the nurse's station. A security guard, a heavy-set man named Ortiz, who had worked the night shift for 9 years without incident, made the mistake of stepping into Dresden's path and reaching for his radio. Dresden shot him twice in the chest without slowing his pace, the suppressed rounds sounding like nothing more than 2 flat coughs swallowed by the hum of fluorescent lights, and Ortiz folded to the tile floor as the first true scream of the night tore through the corridor. Chaos detonated through the emergency room in the space of a single heartbeat. Nurses scattered toward supply closets and locked doors. A patient's family member shrieked and dropped a coffee cup that shattered against the linoleum. Dr. Kane, who had been dozing in his office down the hall after a long shift of doing very little, burst out into the corridor already halfway into a panic, took one look at the body on the floor and the man walking toward him with a pistol raised, and did the only thing his character had ever truly prepared him to do. He turned and ran, shoving a junior nurse out of his path as he fled toward the fire stairs, abandoning his post, his patients, and every oath he had ever sworn in a single act of pure, cowardly self-preservation. Director Alan Whitfield working late over the quarterly reports he had used as an excuse not to open a certain manila envelope, heard the commotion through the floor and felt his stomach drop before his mind caught up to the reason why. He opened the drawer with shaking hands and finally tore the envelope open, and the words on the first page hit him like a physical blow, because the name typed at the top in bold black letters was Elena Cross, and beneath it, in red block capitals reserved for the military's most closely guarded designations, sat a single line that turned his blood to ice water. Major, United States Army, Special Operations Combat Medical Command, Classification Tier 1, decorated, presumed deceased, status corrected, current location confidential. He did not finish reading. He was already running for the stairs. Inside the trauma ward, Elena heard the two flat coughs, heard the scream, heard Ortiz's body strike the floor, and every instinct she had spent years trying to bury rose to the surface at once, cold and clear and utterly without hesitation. She looked once at Cole Bennett, unconscious and defenseless on the bed behind her, and she made the only decision that had ever mattered to her in situations like this one. She was not going to lose another soldier on her watch. She rose from her chair. Her posture changed. The stoop of tired shoulders straightened into something coiled and purposeful, and the softness drained from her face like water from a cracked glass, leaving behind an expression the nurses down the hall would later struggle to describe, because none of them had ever seen it on a human being before. It was the look of a predator who had simply been wearing a very good disguise. Dresden rounded the corner into the trauma bay, expecting a hospital full of soft targets. He found Elena Cross standing directly between him and the bed, empty-handed, unarmed by any conventional measure, and he made the same mistake every antagonist in her life had eventually made. He underestimated her, and he paid for it in the space of 4 seconds. He raised the pistol. She was already moving. She closed the distance before his brain finished processing that she had moved at all, her hand snapping out to redirect his wrist a half-second before the trigger finished its pull, sending the suppressed round punching harmlessly into the ceiling tile above them in a burst of white dust. Her other hand drove upward into his elbow with a crack that echoed through the corridor, and the pistol clattered from fingers that no longer obeyed him. He tried to recover. He was fast, trained, dangerous by any ordinary standard. Against her, he was simply late. She caught his collar and used his own forward momentum to drive him face first into the steel frame of an empty gurney, then swept his legs from beneath him with a motion so economical it barely looked like effort at all. He hit the floor hard enough to crack a rib, and before he could draw the breath to scream, her knee was already planted between his shoulder blades, his own broken arm wrenched up behind him at an angle that promised worse if he so much as twitched. "Somebody go get security," she said, her voice utterly level, as though she were requesting a chart refill rather than reporting an armed intruder she had just single-handedly disarmed. Nobody moved. Every nurse, every terrified family member, every wide-eyed intern peering around the corner simply stared, because the woman they had spent 6 weeks dismissing as unremarkable had just ended a gunfight in under 5 seconds without so much as raising her voice. It was in that frozen, disbelieving silence that Director Whitfield burst through the double doors at the end of the hallway, manila file still clutched in his white-knuckled hand, chest heaving from the 6 flights of stairs he had taken 2 at a time. He stopped dead at the sight in front of him, the fallen security guard, the disarmed shooter pinned beneath a woman he had approved for the worst shift rotation in the entire hospital, and the words on the page in his hand rearranged themselves into a truth he had been too busy, too dismissive, too blind to see. "Major," he said, the word coming out cracked and unfamiliar in his mouth. Major Cross. Before Elena could answer, the sound of rotor blades thundered somewhere above the building, a heavy, percussive rhythm that rattled the window panes of the emergency room, and sent dust sifting down from the ceiling tiles. Red and blue lights strobed against the glass entrance as 3 black government vehicles screeched into the ambulance bay, doors already opening before the wheels had fully stopped, and out of the lead vehicle stepped a broad-chested man in dress uniform, 3 stars gleaming on each shoulder, his face carved from the same granite discipline that had built entire careers on his word alone. General Marcus Holloway crossed the emergency room floor like a man who had waited 2 years for this exact moment and refused to let one more second slip past him unused. His voice, when it came, boomed through the corridor with the force of a pronouncement rather than a greeting, silencing the last murmurs of shocked staff still clustered against the walls. "Major Elena Cross," he said, standing at attention as though the tiled floor beneath him were a parade ground. "We have been searching for you for 2 years." Elena rose from Dresden's pinned body, handing him off wordlessly to the security officers who had finally arrived, and turned to face the general with the same steady composure she had carried through every shift, every insult, every graveyard rotation Belhaven general had thrown at her. "2 years is a long time to keep looking, General," she said quietly. "I wasn't hiding especially well." "You were hiding exactly well enough," Holloway answered, and then he turned to address the room, his voice pitched to carry to every stunned face pressed against the trauma ward's glass partitions, to the nurses who had laughed at her file, to the interns who had never bothered to learn her name, to Director Whitfield, who stood frozen with the classified folder still trembling in his grip. "What you are looking at," he announced, "is not a nurse who couldn't cut it anywhere real. What you are looking at is the single most decorated combat medic our special operations community has produced in the last 20 years, and the only reason any of you are standing here breathing right now is that she chose, once again, not to let good people die on her watch." He told them about Operation Black Hollow, a night raid 2 years earlier that had gone wrong in the worst way a mission could go wrong, an ambush sprung by a source inside their own chain of command, an entire extraction team pinned down 11 kilometers from the nearest friendly position with half their number wounded, and the enemy closing from 3 directions. He told them how Major Elena Cross had carried 2 men across those 11 kilometers on her own back, one at a time, returning twice into contact to drag out survivors while directing air support through a shattered radio held together with medical tape, and how the official record had listed her as killed in action for nearly a year before intelligence finally confirmed she had survived, badly wounded, and gone quietly into recovery under a new identity to protect the ongoing investigation into the mole who had sold her team's position to the enemy in the first place. "The scar on her shoulder," he said, his voice dropping just slightly, softening at the edges for the only time that night, was not from a car accident. It was from a piece of shrapnel that came within 4 centimeters of severing her spine while she was still carrying the second soldier out of that valley, and she did not stop walking until both men were breathing on a helicopter deck. A silence settled over the emergency room, thick and reverent, broken only by the mechanical hum of monitors and the distant wail of an ambulance still inbound. Somewhere in that silence, Cole Bennett stirred on his bed, his eyes opening just enough to catch the shape of the general standing beside the woman who had once carried him across 11 kilometers of hostile territory, and a single tear tracked down his temple into the pillow, though no one but Elena noticed it at all. It was the mole, of course, who had sent Victor Dresden to finish what the ambush had failed to accomplish, the same source inside the chain of command, still terrified that Cole Bennett's testimony would finally surface and unravel 2 years of carefully constructed cover. And General Holloway's team had traced the funding for the hit 2 days earlier, which was precisely why the classified file had landed on Director Whitfield's desk with such urgency in the first place, a warning meant to protect Bennett before Dresden ever found him. It had simply arrived one procrastinated budget meeting too late. Director Whitfield found his voice at last, though it came out smaller than he intended, thinner, stripped of the authority he usually wore so easily. "General," he said, "I owe this woman an apology I don't think I can adequately put into words." "Save it for the man who deserves the rest of what's coming," Holloway said, and turned his gaze toward the fire stairwell where a familiar figure had just reappeared, drawn back by curiosity or cowardice, or some combination of both. Dr. Gerald Kane, still pale from his earlier flight, straightening his coat as though he had merely stepped out for air rather than abandoned his post at the first sign of gunfire. Kane made the mistake of speaking before he fully understood the room he had walked into. "General," he began, an oily, practiced smoothness sliding back into his voice as though nothing at all had happened. "I want to assure you that this department runs a tight ship, and whatever misunderstanding occurred regarding this nurse's file." Director Whitfield cut him off with a coldness that surprised even himself. "You ran, Gerald. In the middle of a shooting with patients in your care, you ran and left a security guard bleeding on the floor and a nurse alone to face an armed killer. A nurse you spent 6 weeks humiliating in front of this entire staff." His voice climbed, the shock of the last 10 minutes finally curdling into something closer to fury. "You are done. Effective immediately. Security will escort you to collect your belongings, and I will personally ensure the medical board hears every detail of tonight." Kane's mouth opened and closed twice without producing a sound, the color draining from his face as the weight of his own cowardice settled onto shoulders that had spent years pretending to carry authority they had never actually earned. He looked around the corridor for support, and found none. Only the flat, unimpressed stares of nurses who had watched him mock the one person in the building who had actually saved their lives that night, and something in his posture finally collapsed under the accumulated weight of it, his shoulders sagging, his chin dropping, the tyrant of Belhaven's emergency room reduced in a single sentence to exactly what he had always been underneath the title. Security arrived within the minute, and Kane was walked out through the same sliding doors he had once used as his personal kingdom's entrance, his career unraveling in real time behind him, a formal inquiry already forming in Whitfield's mind before the man had even cleared the parking lot. There would be no severance package generous enough to erase what every witness in that hallway had seen him do, and word of it, Whitfield knew, would spread through every hospital administration in the state long before any hearing convened. The staff who remained, the ones who had frozen in the hallway, and the ones who had spent 6 quiet weeks looking past Elena Cross as though she were furniture, began to close in around her now, not with fear but with something closer to reverence, a slow ripple of applause building from the back of the corridor, until it broke over her in a wave she had not asked for and did not particularly want. She stood there and absorbed it the way she absorbed most things, with a quiet dignity that refused to perform gratitude it did not feel entitled to. General Holloway placed a hand on her shoulder, the good one, careful even now of old wounds nobody else in that hallway could see. "There's a debriefing waiting, Major," he said, "and a medal ceremony the Pentagon has been sitting on for 2 years because nobody could find you to pin it on. Your country hasn't forgotten what you did in that valley. It just took entirely too long to say so out loud." Elena glanced once toward Cole Bennett's bed, watched the rise and fall of his chest, steady into something closer to peace, and allowed herself, for the first time in 6 weeks, something that resembled the ghost of a smile. "He'll need a real hospital and a security detail that doesn't sleep," she told the general. All business again, the moment of applause already folded away and filed somewhere she could access later, if ever. And someone should tell the board here that their intake protocol let an armed contractor walk through a supply closet without a badge check. "Consider it told," Holloway said, and something in his own weathered face softened at the sound of her voice slipping so easily back into command, as though 6 weeks of indignity had never touched her at all. She did not gloat over Kane's ruin, though every person in that hallway would have forgiven her if she had. She simply gathered her things from the nurse's station with the same economy of motion she brought to everything, folded her final chart notes into neat, legible handwriting for whoever inherited her patients, and walked out through the same sliding glass doors she had entered through 6 weeks earlier, this time flanked not by a duffel bag and a redacted transfer letter, but by a 3-star general and the quiet, permanent respect of everyone who had finally learned to see her. Belhaven General never quite returned to what it had been before that night. Director Whitfield overhauled security protocols within a week and personally ensured Elena's file, once it was declassified enough to share, hung framed in the staff lounge as a reminder that the quietest person in the room is very often the most dangerous one, and very often the one who has already saved you before you ever knew you needed saving. Cole Bennett recovered fully under military protection, and years later would tell anyone who asked that the finest combat medic he had ever served with had spent 6 weeks being handed the worst shifts a civilian hospital could offer without a single complaint, because that was simply who she was. There is a lesson in what happened at Belhaven General that night, and it has little to do with rank or medals or the satisfying collapse of a coward who never deserved his title in the first place. It has everything to do with the ordinary-looking people passing through our lives, wearing scrubs or coveralls or quiet smiles, carrying scars we assume were bought cheaply, and stories we never bothered to ask about, when in truth some of them have already walked through fire so the rest of us never had to. Respect is not owed to the loudest voice in the room. It is owed to the ones who show up anyway. If this story moved you even a little, do something small for the person who told it to you. Hit that like button before you go. Share this with someone who needs to be reminded that heroes rarely announce themselves. Subscribe to this channel if you want more stories exactly like this one, waiting for you around the next corner. Drop a comment below and tell us honestly, would you have seen Elena Cross for who she truly was, or would you have handed her the worst shift too? We will see you in the next story.